A warm welcome to everybody. This is a really important session looking at issues ranging from low carbon homes and passive house right through to thinking about what this means in terms of the health and well-being of our citizens. And this is not just an English-centric edition of Happy Hour. We're taking a spotlight on Wales and Scotland as well. So I'm really delighted that we have a broad church here today. As we may know, the Happy Hour series we've been running this autumn continues as a virtual event, and we're also looking forward to making an announcement later this autumn about our annual summit in December. But for now, we're really pleased that we've got excellent speakers this afternoon to really address the issues around both passive house but also active ageing. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the reins to a great supporter of the HousingLIN, Mark Slater, and your team at Westbody Arcadia. Thanks very much for your support, and you're going to give us an overview of the Designing for Sustainability.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeremy, and I'll just share my screen with the presentation. So I hope everyone can see that.
That's perfect.
Yeah, so I'm just going to give a brief overview on designing for future sustainability, and I thought what better way to start than just introduce myself. So I'm Mark Slater from Westbody Arcadia. We are we're planners, urban designers and architects, do a variety of sizes and scales of projects, and we also have certified passive. So just to set the scene really, just to give you an idea of the urgency of the sort of matters that we're dealing with here. The concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is the highest it's ever been. This is leading to global warming effects, I'm sure you all know. And the 20 warmest years on record have been the last 22 years, which I found quite amazing, really, when I discovered that statistic. And the world is hotter by 1.1 degrees from 100 years ago, and with 1.5 deemed to be the maximum safe rise by scientists. And that's led to a number of extreme sort of weather events. 2021 has seen quite a few of these already. So we had the flooding in Germany. We had the hottest autumn in 100 years. It was even hot in Scotland, which is quite amazing, really. And we've got the wildfires in the United States and across other parts of the globe. So the UK government's deciding to do something about this finally, which is great, especially within the built environment. So they have set a target of all housing to be zero carbon, which is great, and for new build properties that's a in many ways. But 80% of the homes that we occupy in 2050 are already built, so that is quite a considerable task to improve those existing properties to reach the necessary energy performance levels. And social landlord properties have to be a minimum of rating of an EPC rating of C by 2030. So these things are coming down the tracks quite quickly. And the built environment is a huge user of carbon in the UK's carbon footprint, with 42%, which is not far off half. And just over half of this is used in the operational energy of our buildings. So that's through heating and through operational uses through electricity and electrical appliances. So sort of what's the future? How do we try and address this together? So one option is we go back to the land and we all live in a sort of permaculture way, grow our own crops, and have a very light touch approach to living. An alternative option is we all live in a very small sustainable pod, which requires very little energy to run. I think both of these options are, quite extreme, and we'll probably have to meet in the middle, especially, as those options are especially not suitable for specialist and supported housing. And so we've got to have a holistic approach to future development. And one way of achieving this is through Passivhaus. So I'm just going to give a quick overview to Passivhaus, and hopefully I won't get too technical for anyone. But basically the standard, Passivhaus is a quality assurance certification scheme developed in Germany. And the idea behind it is to have a high level of occupant comfort while using very little energy for heating and cooling. The idea of this is it requires buildings to be tested independently. Now, typically this isn't the case, and if you say you're going to put a certain amount of insulation in, then that is just approved. Whereas the Passivhaus scheme will come and check that you're putting that level of insulation and that it performs to the levels required. And the overall output of this is that it achieves a 75% reduction in space heating demands when compared to a standard new build. So that's a considerable reduction in energy usage on a standard new build property. So the basic principles of Passivhaus are firstly to ensure high indoor air quality. So that's providing good quality fresh air into the property whilst extracting the stale air. Is to ensure thermal comfort, so you're not too hot in the summer and not too warm, not too cold in the winter. Is to ensure good acoustic comfort as well. To reduce the heating demands, so that will reduce the amount of energy needed to heat your homes. It ensures that details and products work better, so that's on the designers really to make sure that they're detailing the building to minimise heat loss. And it also encourages use of efficient electrical appliances and lighting and such like. So how do we achieve this? So I'm just going to quickly run through the sort of basic principles behind sort of designing a Passivhaus. So what you want to do is try and maximise the solar gains in the winter. So I liken this to if you if you're cold in winter and there's a patch of it's a nice frosty day and there's a patch of sun. If you go and stand in that, you immediately feel warmer. Whereas in the summer, you want to try and avoid the sun and normally want to try and find some shade to cool down. And that's no different really to how you start designing a Passivhaus. That's the sort of general principle. And the other thing you need to do is to try and minimize the external surface area. So if you have a very complicated shape, you can imagine that you're increasing the surface area, so there's more contact between the external air, which is generally cooler, and the property itself. So the next step is to keep the heat in. So again, if you imagine this in a sort of alternative viewpoint, it's essentially like putting a big coat on. It prevents heat loss and will basically keep the occupants warm. And then you want to ensure there are no gaps. So you need to ensure it's completely airtight, and you want to prevent uncontrolled loss of heat. So in many properties, I know my house, that there are holes everywhere in the external walls, and it's no wonder that you lose so much heat. So what you want to do is try and create a completely airtight external fabric. You also want to install great windows. Now, if you imagine in a Passivhaus, typically the walls are sort of 400 to 500 millimeters thick, which is considerable, whereas your windows are very thin. So you need to make sure that they're losing as little heat as possible. So you want those to be triple glazed, and they also have to be positioned in the correct location to make the most of those solar gains that I spoke about earlier. And you also want to make sure you're not puncturing the insulation level. I mean, this is quite a crude example I've shown where I've just drawn, essentially if you had a beam running through the roof of the building there, essentially the cold air would track along that, and it would enter into the property and creates what's called a thermal bridge. Now that needs careful detailing by the design team to ensure there are minimal thermal bridges within the design. And the last sort of basic principle is to install mechanical ventilation. So this allows for a more controlled environment, and essentially what you are doing is you are using the waste heat from showering, from your body heat, from kitchens, putting that past fresh air coming in, which is warmed. So essentially it creates a very efficient way of heating the building and also extracting, whilst at the same time extracting stale air. So in summary, we need to act to prevent further damaging consequences of increased carbon in the atmosphere, and we need to act now. The built environments, as you can see, is a big culprit of carbon usage, and we need to ensure that we're minimising the amount of energy used in the industry. You need a holistic approach to balance a variety of factors. I mean, obviously, there are other factors to design other than just energy loss and sustainability, but I think this is, becoming more and more important in the way that we as architects design. And Passivhaus is a good certified method for achieving the targets. And we are now going to hear from some great examples of how that's been put into practice. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Mark. That was really good and a really concise overview, and I've learned a hell of a lot as well. We're going to move on. We're going to hear some examples of practice, and we're really pleased that Patrick McMorrow can be here from IBI Group. So, Patrick, are you there?
Hello. Hi, Jeremy. Thank you.
And thanks very much. I don't think you're in Canada, but I know you're Canadian origin. So, welcome to our happy hour. Over to you.
Okay, start sharing my screen. Thanks very much for having me, Jeremy. You can see my screen okay?
Yeah, that's great. It's up now. Yeah.
Super. Yeah, so my name is Patrick McMorrow. I'm an architect with IBI Group, and we're kind of a global architecture, engineering and technology company. And I've been working in Vancouver, Canada on Passivhaus projects, and then now in the last number of years working with the Cardiff office on healthcare projects. So I want to share those and the lessons learned applying Passivhaus principles and achieving Passivhaus certified projects. So I'll start by setting the scene for our projects. And we'll continue then take a look at how that context is evolving in those Welsh-specific healthcare projects. And like I said, I'll spend a little bit of time on the Canadian projects at the end. But in Wales, we have the NHS Decarbonisation Plan, strategic delivery. So that's a key piece of infrastructure alongside the Healthier Wales plan. And the two of those are kind of the driving force for the direction of these projects from the outset. But as designers, we see having these government strategies in place as an advantage to kind of set the brief for healthcare projects we're undertaking, and try to define from the outset what those decarbonisation strategies are. And we've taken Passivhaus as kind of how Mark excellently described it, kind of a certification process, a package standard for energy use in buildings. And we've used that as our toolkit to kind of respond to one part of the decarbonisation plan. So these projects that we're looking at are integrated healthcare projects. So, they're critical and located in the heart of communities. So these diagrams that you see here is typical for health boards and trusts or local authorities like to understand how healthcare could plug into the greater community. And so it would be linked with active aging, housing, and other types of housing cooperatives. So, a one-stop shop healthcare service can be a critical piece of infrastructure, and if that can also achieve the decarbonisation plans for government, we're achieving multiple goals there. So at IBI Group, we're fortunately involved in 4 key projects in Wales in 3 different health board geographies, and I'll start to just tell you about those now. This is Newport East. and it's a health and well-being centre in a regeneration area in the Ringland area of Newport. So the stakeholders are the Health Board, Newport City Council, and Newport City Homes. You know, like I said, this was one of the first projects where we applied the Passivhaus principles to achieve decarbonisation goals. So the council has just completed remodelling the community hub, which will be linked into this health and wellbeing centre. So you can see in the next image here how the project on the right is the health and wellbeing, and the hub is in existence. I'm going to talk in detail about the strategies for a later project. So I'm just going to give a high-level introduction to these different ones that we're doing. But we're finding that the partners in this, the different partners bring different pieces to it, and collaboration can kind of be driven by having this one overarching strategy, which is the NHS Decarbonization Strategy. It's been a really useful tool. Bringing all the stakeholders together. So this project that I'll touch on is Swansea Health and Wellbeing Centre. So looking at a city centre, more central location in the heart of Swansea, you know, with a diverse community and extremely challenging health outcomes. So coastal housing are responsible for a lot of regeneration programs on the high street here. And they're partnered with the Health Board for the development of this project. So other stakeholders would be the council and the university, who will deliver services from within the building. So you can see how this building is kind of starting to fulfill some of the potential we see in the kind of visionary diagrams that show this one-stop shop and integrated healthcare provision. So here's an idea of how it will look on the street, you know, and interesting then to look at this through the Passivhaus lens that Mark described, how we want to think about a super insulated building, managing how the windows are laid out and how heat gains can come from the sun, but also managing overheating and things like that. But because this is a city centre site, we can have you know, reasonably large fenestration because of party walls and adjacencies in other parts of the building. So there's not a requirement for glazing on all four sides. And in fact, that allows us to get a relatively high glazing ratio here. Again, the same outcomes. The decarbonisation strategy is helping us at the early stages of that design to set the goals and begin like applying the Passivhaus kind of principles of and then setting those targets which are better than building regulations, better than Part-L requirements. And we can get those, the earlier we get those locked in, the better for us and for everyone in the project who's designing and budgeting and forecasting how these can be achieved. So this project is Parkview in Ely. And it's you know, one of the more deprived wards in the capital and in Cardiff. So it sits within a wider master plan with broader community services, including police, fire, rescue, council hub, and then third sector services, library services, and health services. So the council hub in this location has been one of the most successful hubs with large take-up in services. So this health and wellbeing centre adjacent to the council hub is expected to be successful and increase that integration of service provision for the community. So let's move forward here. This is at an earlier stage in design, and I can describe how we are using, you know, assemblies as in U values and insulation thicknesses to achieve what we're calling Passivhaus standard. and also achieving air tightness levels and levels of efficiency in our ventilation systems to get to the Passivhaus standard. So those are the health and well-being centres, and in this project that I'll do a deeper dive into is a radiotherapy unit in Abergavenny, and this is also, you know, under the same strategy. So we're learning lessons from each one, and this is probably the more developed design at this point. So that's why I'm going to take this. But the nice thing about using the Passivhaus standard is, you know, it's international. So even lessons learned from projects in Vancouver can be applied to projects in Cardiff, and projects in Wales can be applied to the UK and to England, projects in Scotland and elsewhere. So here is the decarbonisation strategy, and you can see it's about reducing carbon emissions, and carbon emissions is more than just what the building uses as it's being built, as it's being operated. You know, the energy that's used when you plug things in, or as the building is the lighting and the ventilation. We also need to think about the embodied carbon, which is the carbon that goes into building it. And so we're looking for targets to define those two things, the operational and the embodied carbon. And NHS Wales strategy at the moment doesn't define those, but it gives a framework which is aligned with this UK Green Building Council framework for how to reduce them. And the reason is because those targets are still evolving, particularly embodied carbon, you know, as we're at kind of an early stage of measuring that, but the importance of measuring that has been recognized widely. But I think these 5 steps, you know, establish the scope as a starting point is really important. Reduce the construction impacts, that relates to reducing what is the operational, the embodied carbon, the carbon that goes into making the building. Then the operational energy use. And then after doing those 2 reduction strategies, then you can begin to add renewables or offset. So that's kind of just like the time, the sequencing that we see as being important. And this is just to give an idea of what the targets could be and should be. So the places we go to are LETI, who publish targets for both of these, and they are aligned with REBA strategy targets, REBA 2030. And so just to give a quick idea of how those targets for embodied energy are coming out in our healthcare projects, we're seeing you know, reductions where we can apply strategies. For example, I'll move forward and show you the example at satellite therapy unit here, where we look at the structure of the building, and we look at concrete, steel, and timber. And we're really looking to work with an excellent structural engineer who can help us with these analysis. And then we take it through a workflow and try and decide, you know, through process of elimination and analysis, how much energy it takes to either produce the concrete, produce the steel, or produce the timber, bring it to site, assemble it, and then finish the building, and then its maintenance through its life, come up with the optimized strategy. And obviously cost has to be taken into consideration in these analysis of the embodied carbon. So that's all important to understand, but also I want to kind of explain that embodied carbon is not actually part of Passivhaus strategy, and Passivhaus only talks to the use of energy in the building while it's running. So they're the key strategies. I'm going to quickly go through the same strategies that Mark mentioned, just to kind of reiterate them, but to now jump from that embodied carbon into the Passivhaus piece of the puzzle, the operational energy. We're looking to reduce energy by optimal insulation, air tightness, so that means, you know, continuous membranes around our detailing. So for architects and builders, that's kind of an addition beyond what the regulations require, and regulations are getting more stringent, but the requirement is more strict when you go to the Passivhaus standard, and all that leads to less air leakage and less heat loss. Then we're also working on thermal bridge-free detailing. So that means, for example, we have a canopy or a steel column. It can't go from inside to outside because the heat is going to transfer through that element. Or here, where it's a balcony, typically that may have been a cast concrete balcony in conventional construction that went from inside to outside, but now we have to look at technological solutions like thermal breaks, where we cast concrete and split it either side. Then we're looking at high performance windows and doors, triple glazed, and we're looking at heat recovery. And that means when the heat in the building is being ventilated and we're bringing fresh air in, that the heat is being recovered from that stale air that's being taken out and transferred. So the air doesn't want to touch each other. It's just about transferring the heat from the stale air into the fresh air, and both passing by one another. So what did applying those principles mean to us at the satellite radiotherapy unit in Abergavenny? Well, it meant we needed to increase the U values, or improve the U values, which would mean the numbers reduce. So the U values you can see here, there's parallel minimums. We had to go up to Passivhaus standard, and that means thicker walls, thicker roofs, and thicker floor assemblies. So it's important to kind of define this as early as possible in the project, because increasing thicknesses leads to changing of space layouts and floor plans. And here's an idea of how the roof assembly works. The other important part of increasing insulation is that you need to minimize any metal, typically, that might be going through an insulation layer. And you want to use a less conductive material, because say there's a metal stud that's holding your cladding on the outside, that could be transferring a lot of heat through your insulation layer. So we'll try and use the laser pointer. Yeah, for example, here on the roof, you can see that there's a kind of a non-conductive clip that is holding the outer layer of the roof to the main structure. And that's really important, because these are thermal bridges, but they can occur lots of time, many times, if they're part of your typical assembly. So you start by getting your typical wall roof assembly correct. And then we move on to look at specific junctions, which we call point thermal bridges or linear thermal bridges, if they happen along a line, like down here where the ground floor slab meets the wall. So, we looked at these in SRU with the detail lens, and it means things like putting in thermal breaks at different places at the parapet or at where the ground floor slab meets. And I just want to show this image to show that, we did these things, but the whole time the design and the beauty of the building is not affected. There's still potential for glazing. There's still potential for any of the aesthetic desires or requirements that can be achieved and can be enhanced even through the improved indoor air quality that you get with a Passivhaus standard building. I'm conscious of time, and I just wanted to show these are some of the early sketch details we do, where we're thinking about how the thermal break, for example, on a column, or where the elevator pit comes down, where we need to, insulate that elevator pit, or where it changes from, in plan, the insulation wrapping all of our structure. And just a visual on what that actually looks like in real world. That means when we say thermal break in steel, it often means, a piece of plastic, which is quite rigid, urethane, and that would be in the same layer as the insulation. So instead of the steel going the whole way through, say here on a canopy, you now have this pad, a urethane pad, or on a column, it sits on top of that pad and then it's bolted through. So you're minimizing the number of steel connections through the building. Another important piece to look at would be how a window is installed, because you're trying to get the window in line with the insulation. So, for example, this is a window jamb detail, and typically the window would sit back here on top of the structure. this outer part here is the thick insulation that's wrapping the building. And we're trying to push the window out into the insulation layer. And the reason for that is because the heat would kind of bypass the insulation if the window is sitting back here. And this is the typical kind of isotherms you want to see when analysis is done on your detailing, to see that, you know, all the cold is basically staying on the outside and the warm is staying on the other side. And there's no kind of pinch point where the heat can kind of bypass your insulation and kind of shortcut the hard work you've done in spending money on high performance windows and high performance assemblies. So I'm going to start wrapping up now, but the other piece to look at with windows is about shading to minimize overheating, because overheating is a risk, and it's important to do that analysis early on. And so this is the atrium space at that radiotherapy unit, and we looked at a number of different options for different types of shading and how they might help to minimize the overheating. I'm going to quickly go through a couple of more slides. I want to just show a project in Canada, which is a large community housing project in Ottawa. And this is just about ventilation and housing, where I want to mention, you know, the difference between doing centralized or decentralized. So decentralized meaning in suite, where you just have one, you have a standalone unit inside an apartment building, for example, that is bringing in fresh air and extracting the stale air from that one unit. And the example I want to compare that to is a tower that we're doing, which is doing to the Passivhaus standard, which is going to have centralized ventilation. So it's just to show the concept that either of those types of ventilation work for the Passivhaus standard. To talk briefly about this project, it's a 60-story tower, so it's a really exciting project we have now in Vancouver, IBI office, but 25% of this is going to be social housing. So it kind of shows the power of when a city council embraces a standard like this, they can have social housing delivered to this standard. And I know that's happened in Norwich and the UK as well. But in this case, the developer is building the housing to the Passivhaus standard so as to get their land rezoned to get the market housing on that site. So it's a win-win scenario. These are just some ideas of the floor plan, how this works. But there's ventilation shafts inside the building, and there's 3 rooms that house the HRVs. And then the air, those are larger ventilation units with large ducts, and in this case, even the developer gets exclusions for the air, the space that those ventilation ducts take up. So they're allowed to have extra area in the building to provide this fresh, clean air to the Passivhaus standard that's, you know, using less energy. Just wanted to briefly share that kind of whistle-stop tour of a number of projects. But to finish, I want to bring it back to, you know, the Welsh context, and kind of encouragement that Passivhaus is a standard you can kind of quickly get to grips with, because it's quite focused and clear on how operational energy can be reduced and what the targets to reduce to are. And those targets pop up again and again in different standards. When you look at the RIBA Architecture 2030, or you look at the LETI standards, those are all aligned to the Passivhaus standard. So it's a standard for me that has been you know, easy to engage with and start from, and then apply to projects, whatever they be, housing, healthcare, education. It kind of works across the board. So thanks for your time, and stop sharing now.
Patrick, thanks for your time as well. That was a really illuminating presentation, both in terms of the Welsh context around those hubs, but also the vertical living that you showed from Vancouver. And it really reminds me of some of the sort of vertical forests and the greening of vertical living in Milan as well, which I've seen in the past. and perhaps even going back some years to Hundertwasser and some of the stuff in Vienna as well. So there's some real good synergies here. Lots of great learning, and look forward to picking up on some of these things, perhaps along with Mark, about both the architecture but also the social architecture and those partnerships. We focus very much so with you and Mark around some of the new build. We also want to think a bit more about retrofitting our existing communities as well. And some of the great work that is going on in Swansea, and both that you described, but also with Swansea University. So it's a great pleasure that I can invite Carol Maddock from the Centre for Innovation and Ageing at Swansea University and the Active Building Centre. And she's going to join us now, I hope. So over to you, Carol. And definitely slides are on screen, but I think you're still behind your stop video.
Oh, right, okay. It's, hang on a minute. Hopefully I'll get there any minute now. Right.
No rush. But I can see you, and you can put your screen onto slideshow, even better.
I knew it would all go horribly wrong from
that's perfect.
Great.
So we're on screen now.
Thanks ever so much also for joining us this afternoon, and I've had great pleasure of being part of the project group behind the scenes on the advisory group, so I know a little bit about it, but please do share amongst the LIN members.
Brilliant, and thank you very much, and thanks very much for the opportunity to be part of this session. And I've learnt loads too, and it's really great that I've had the previous speakers actually setting the scene for me, and I'm really excited to see that the projects going on in around Wales and Swansea, and in fact I used to be a therapy radiographer, so it was all very exciting for me to learn all about that. But anyway, I'm just going to be presenting today on behalf of the Healthy Living in Low Carbon Homes team, and that's essentially us on the picture. That's me and Deb Morgan, who's the senior researcher on the project, and I'm going to provide a little context about where our project sits within the larger project 2. I'm not able to, there you go. So our specific research sits within the Active Building Centre Research Programme, and that's funded by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and that's part of the UKRI Transforming Construction Challenge. So the Active Building Centre Research Programme is led by the team at Swansea, and it brings together 10 universities with businesses and service providers aiming to test innovative technologies and ideas that will ensure buildings of all scale contribute to a more stable power grid. The active building concept aims to integrate net zero or low carbon buildings within the wider energy infrastructure. And that's going to be resulting in better performing buildings and improved grid services. So the ABC Research Programme activities are also focused on enabling the construction industry to transform into a net zero emissions building sector within the next 30 years. So this gives hopefully a little bit of where we sit within the wider project as well. So the research framework comprises of a number of work packages, and each provide insights into different areas. So that ranges from novel heat storage, data gathering and analytics, building design and optimization, some of which I think we've heard about by the previous speakers, and software development and human interfaces. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a little bit different, I think. So we're critically talking about the human elements. We're looking at social sciences, we're looking at the person-centered and the well-being perspective from those inhabitants of the buildings and homes. And we really want to also explore more about the motivations and values and behaviours of the people who either move into new low-carbon homes or who have their homes retrofitted to low carbon or more higher efficiency standards. And as part of our project, we're looking at this socio-economic analysis that's described there in the red circle. So we're developing the parameters for this determining of the social return on investment. And we want really to sort of focus on the outcomes from a variety of stakeholders, but in particular about the residents of the homes. And so that's what I'm looking at here. So I'm just going to briefly introduce the concept of the social return on investment. And this definition is taken from the Guide to SROI, and it acknowledges that our actions and activities create and destroy value. And the value goes far beyond what can be captured in financial terms. But for the most part, this is what is captured and measured and accounted for in many projects. But a social return on investment is a framework for measuring and accounting for a much wider and broader concept of value. It seeks to reduce inequality and environmental degradation and improve well-being by incorporating social, environmental and economic costs and benefits. It basically tells the story of how change is being created. In short, an SROI measures change in ways that are relevant to the people or the organisations that experience or contribute to the change. And if we don't fully understand and capture the social value created by, for example, retrofitting of properties, information is missed that can be useful to the wider project and stakeholders, and in fact beyond. So ABC is interested in social return on investment as a way to demonstrate value to various stakeholders. So in our project, we've particularly started from the point that the driving question of energy efficiency projects should be, what does this building mean? And what do these homes mean for those who use them, for those who live in these homes? And from our research perspective, again, we are also focusing particularly on older people. And we have identified and involved stakeholders by means of an expert panel and an advisory board, which Jeremy mentioned, and thankfully he's one of our members. But our expert panel consists of lay older adults with diverse domestic energy consumption experiences. They might be, have experienced fuel poverty. They might have been on tenants associations, etc. So they're a multidisciplinary group of stakeholders, and certainly on our advisory board, we've co-opted people, as I said, including Jeremy. And these two groups of people have actually helped us develop a theory of change or a conceptual model, and that forms the basis of the social return on investment. And so using this model, we're hopefully more likely to capture the outcomes that matter to those who are directly affected by the changes. And hopefully we'll now be able to measure that which is important to those people and a variety of stakeholders too. So as I said, the return on investment needs to be extended to incorporate wider understandings of value. And we've certainly been trying to focus on doing this. And so we're really exploring that at the moment. So at the moment, I'm describing a project that's, we should be coming towards the end, but because of delays, etc., we're actually sort of delayed in where we should be, where we are compared to where we should be. So I'm just going to show you there, this is our conceptual model, our conceptual framework. And we started out when we first envisaged the project is that we were going to be looking at people who were moving into low carbon new build homes. They were going to be social housing mainly, but they were going to be new build homes. And so we developed this model, and it's looking at a variety of potential outcomes related to well-being in terms of health, social and financial well-being. And this is again sort of particularly focused on those people who are going to be in the homes, but we will be also looking at other stakeholders as well. So if you look at this this model, it was over 3 periods of time. There was going to be the pre-move, so people living in their old house and then moving into a low carbon home. Then time 2 was going to be a few months after they'd moved into this low carbon home, and then we're going to be conducting some interviews with them. And then time 3 was hopefully going to be about a year from the start, and that would have been basically to have allowed people to experience the technologies and what was going on in their new home, a complete season, throughout the year, so going from summer to winter, etc. So we are still doing that, and we are also looking at this now from the point of retrofit. So it's going to be pre-retrofit, sort of shortly after retrofit, and then sort of a little bit down the line. But we have had issues around delays, etc. But either way, that's the model, and the tools that we've incorporated to try and measure the health, social and financial well-being are some existing and some newly designed with the help of our expert panel and also the advisory board. So to try and gather this, so there's going to be 2 surveys. One we've distributed already at time 1, and this will be repeated to a great extent at time 3. with the, as I said, the qualitative interviews, which we are currently doing at the moment, in both with homeowners and with registered social landlords and local authorities. So this slide, I acknowledge, is a little bit busy, but this is, I think, it quite accurately captures what is going on with our research at the moment, and in terms of our activities, etc. So as I said, we were initially focused on new builds, but that's us at the top right hand corner of the slide there, outside a new build social house. That was life before the pandemic. That was the December just before everything changed, our world changed. And we were out there with our group of stakeholders looking at some of the features of this new build to be able to explain what the new house what was consisting of there, and they were going to explore. We held our first workshop in there. And so, as I say, new builds, there were delays with construction initially, and then we did shift our emphasis to support Welsh Government in looking at their optimised retrofit programme. And for both, really, our literature review shows there's a tendency to focus on the technological or the economic aspects of some of these processes of decarbonisation and improving energy efficiency, with perhaps less attention to what it might mean for the people moving into the homes or having the retrofit carried out in their homes. And increasingly, this is changing, and we are seeing more research going on in this area. But Shove and colleagues, and the references are at the end actually, have described practices as the interconnected relations between three elements: materials, including the built environment; meanings, such as norms and aspirations; perceptions; and reasoning in carrying out practices. Oops. Oh dear, I've just whistled through there, sorry about that. And competencies in understanding, know-how, and cognitive routines. So what we are aiming to do now is look, because of the delays and the reduced numbers that we're likely to get, is that we're looking at a case study approach. So we have the new builds, and thanks to the Brussels retrofit, because that was the only image I could actually find of something that might depict a life cycle of retrofitting. And I think we have to consider lots of different eventualities of people that are going to be involved in the process of retrofitting, of the contractors, subcontractors, etc. And so we are looking at these different new builds, retrofits, and I think the bottom right of the screen is describing a little bit about the optimised retrofit there, the numbers of partners involved, the number of registered social landlords, of local authorities, the number of homes, and the number of funding, the amount of funding that's been put in. So we're trying to make sure that we're considering all of this and the little panel on the left there looks at the people that we're going to be interviewing and having workshops with. So it's our expert panel and advisory board, the tenants, and the local authority and RSLs that we're looking at speaking over the next few months, actually. So this was, I think, covered a little bit in the past previous presentation about the drivers to decarbonise. I think we're all very much aware of what we need to. I'm sorry, I keep pressing my mouse pad to. So we're basically, Welsh Government has committed to achieve net zero by no later than 2050, and that's in both new homes and those retrofitted. We've got to try and upgrade our existing housing stock. And so this is what we're doing in our project. We're looking at these two sort of scenarios, and we're still looking at the wellbeing outcomes, but as I said, also in a case study approach, looking at the motivations for everyday energy use and behaviours, and why people might agree or not agree to retrofit, and how this might impact on their other environmental credentials and thought processes, etc. So to start off with, as I say, this is all very, we haven't analysed the data, the interviews are actually ongoing at the moment, so this is all sort of very much hot off the press and not fully analysed, etc. But these, I'm pulling out here some of the thoughts that in particular for this one, the RSLs, the registered social landlords, who are sort of caught between the drivers of the Welsh Government, but also their own requirements. And just to say that all of the people that we spoke to all had in their own housing associations, etc. They were already in the process of, or some were a little bit further down the line of decarbonising and looking at how they were going to be going about this before they actually engaged in the Welsh Government's optimised retrofit programme. So you can see that all of them mention, the global warming, there's energy shortages. The key thing really is if we can obviously save our tenants money on their energy bills, they're likely to be able to live a healthier life. They may not be going into fuel poverty, and it helps us if they can pay their energy bills, then they can pay their rent. So that there are these tensions between, the drivers. Well, obviously the biggest thing in decarbonising home is in the value of having a sustainable environment, full stop. But we all need to do our bit. And the big thing about the project is reducing our footprint and also making it so that people can live in a property more comfortably and make sure that they're able to thrive. And then another one talks about the tangible outputs towards the global agenda and being seen to reach that global agenda as an industry and organisation. But also recognising actually what we've been driven along in the timeframes, we should have really started talking to the tenants first. And there's a little bit of tension in both the values and in trying to meet the requirements of targets, but also to meet the requirements of tenants. And then also, this is sort of part of the framework for the social return of investment as well, is that we're trying to understand the meaning of home and what values are there for the different stakeholders. And I'm going to whiz through this because I think we're all aware that we often have quite individual and personal meanings about our home and what we like or don't like about them and what a comfortable home might mean to different people. And these are some of the comments ranging from, first of all, it is in the literature. For homeowners, houses are not just spaces for thermal optimization, they are cultural spaces, carry significant value and exist in a social context. And the first statement, is from one of our stakeholders, one of our expert panel, and she referred to home being a safe and comfortable place. It's the place where I know where things are and how things work, and I can escape behind the front door and shut it, particularly at the moment, referring to COVID, when no one will bother me. And I think this particularly sort of brought it home to me when I've been talking to some of the tenants and have been experiencing the retrofit in their homes, and they didn't feel like safe or comfortable places, and things had changed and they didn't know how things worked, and they couldn't necessarily escape because there were people moving through the house, doing roofs, trunking wires through places, and it really sort of has brought it home to me. And then one of the registered social landlords has talked about the process from their perspective. There is a lot of disruption internally. I mean, there were lots of things that were going outside, such as heat pumps and solar panels, etc. And it's fine, he said, if you're just moving into a property, but he said some of these people, they've really made it home. The wallpaper's immaculate, and we can't match it if you're trunking things and digging things out of the middle of somebody's lounge. And then this woman, the next one is one of the tenants in a hybrid property, and the process just sounded horrific, actually. And the first people, they came in, they did quite a lot of the work, but they ended up sacking them. They didn't know what they were doing. The house flooded, it was pouring down the sockets and switches, and I just sat there and cried. She talked about this happening in the middle of winter. She had arthritis, and she said the only thing I could do, there's no heating, I just had to sit in. They managed to fix the hot water, so she sat in the bath. But then on the positive, this is a younger woman in the last statement there talking about a new build. And she said, I love the layout, I'm in love with the windows. And actually, this was actually a home sort of to passive house standards, so it's quite interesting. I can open them to get the full effect of the wind and the air coming in, and that sort of defeated some of the object. I mean, my skin isn't drying out from too much central heating, it's nice and warm, and the heating has been on all day, and you're not feeling like, oh, I can't breathe, there's no air. All right. So again, now looking at some of the energy behaviours. So it's I think it is important, and this statement here, adopting new technologies involves acknowledging cognitive, symbolic and practical responses. And, you know, these are sort of reflective of some of the statements that I've heard from some of the tenants. The first one is in a new build home and a young family, actually. The house is really warm and provided, provided you keep your windows closed ideally. And this was just after that really hot period of weather we had. And she said, it's weird because in our old house, the natural thing you do is open all the windows, but to keep it cool, you shut the windows and then the vents in the ceiling release cooling in all of the rooms. And so that was her describing that. And she was said, I'm a bit of a whiz, I love the app. But there was another older gentleman in the same development in a smaller property who didn't read, couldn't read, and his daughter was the one who was explaining to him how to use things. And he, at the time, he was just saying he couldn't get cool and he was having difficulty coming to grips with how everything operated. And the last comment there was a woman who was just recently had their retrofit completed, and she was just remarking that she'd gone out shopping with some friends. She's very active. Her husband is mainly housebound, and she said the app was turning the heating off at home, and he was ringing her up saying, I'm at home, I'm freezing. So there's these sorts of practices that we need to actually take into account too. So when we're sort of looking at the value of energy, it is linked to our concept of what a warm, cosy home means, and it is linked to practices of hospitality, etc. And so we do hear of people talking about, there's nothing like a real fire and having a heat source that is direct at your feet for making you feel warm, as opposed to even if the ambient temperature is the same. And one of the other women in a new build house talks about, well, I like to go to bed in a freezing cold bed. She has her windows open. And she also talked about, she understood about when the energy was cheaper and how she dried things, and this is actually my daughter's bedroom at the bottom, but either way, it's she talks about how she actually sort of aired her clothes and knew exactly how long it took and etc. These are sort of built-in practices that is sometimes quite difficult to get around. So just in conclusion then, and as I said, I'm trying to sort of, we haven't finished the project, we're still conducting the interviews, and we will be conducting final surveys as well. But just to try and pull some of my thoughts together, from our expert panel, they've talked about the theory of change, and that can help to determine what's the best approach regarding impacts and costs. Can also tease out better participation and engagement models to ensure success of such programmes. And I think throughout, and this is again one of our advisory board members, transition is only going to succeed if people are being involved in the process from the outset. Our relationship is not about kilowatt hours, but it's more emotional to affect people's behaviours, will involve finances, attitudes, security, confidence, etc. And then again, some of the comments from the local authorities and social landlords. They were told we had about 3 months to spend the funding. Yeah, it's a problem, isn't it? It's all been driven by deadlines. And then one of the tenant liaison officers was saying, she was going out into the where the retrofits are taking place. So it's new to me. I had no idea about anything to do with decarbonisation. So I'm learning with the tenants. There's a lot to learn. And then in response to that, one of the other people in the focus group was talking about, well, yeah, we acknowledge that. And now we're making sure that we've got awareness training. We're rolling it out to all our neighbourhood officers. And then we'll roll it out to the tenants. So we can actually sort of make sure that people are knowledgeable and know what everybody knows what they're talking about, hopefully. And then, again, to be a bit wary, one of the registered landlords was talking about the unintended consequence for those who are already marginalised, and we might risk making their situations worse if we don't bring them on the journey. We really need to match the different agendas, and that's basically the plea, I guess, is that as we're going through these processes, is that it is a learning process. There's a lot happening, and we are working with different models. We're not necessarily working with Passivhaus. We're working at reduced energy or improved energy efficiency and lower carbon. So we've got lots of different models going on. So there is a lot of learning to take into account, really. So essentially that's my my presentation and my references, and hopefully, sorry, I started to garble and go on. Apologies for that.
It was absolutely fantastic. Thanks very much for giving a very concise overview in such a short space of time, because I know this is an active programme, but you have sort of captured a lot of the learning already that's coming through, and the comments in the chat box as well as the in the Q&A show that people have really appreciated the issues around the social value and the meaning of home, as well as the social architecture, not just the technical. So again, a really good balance. And I know we're slightly overrunning, but I hope, Graham, you don't mind. We've now dealt with Wales. We're now coming up to Scotland, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I know you've done some great work there, and we're going to specifically look a bit more at extra care housing and passive house standards and the stuff that you're doing. So welcome, and look forward to hearing your presentation and then putting together the Q&A before you wrap up.
Thanks, Jeremy. Hope everybody can see the screen I've shared. Thanks, Jerome.
That's all good.
Okay, excellent. Good afternoon, everybody. Just a quick introduction. Myself, I am Graham Robertson. I am Head of Development for Lower Housing Association. So we're based up southwest Scotland. We're a registered charity and a registered social landlord, and we own and manage around 2,500 properties and homes across the Dumfries and Galloway region. So our main remit covers social rented accommodation. We also have supported housing, sheltered housing. We have some university accommodation and some shared ownership properties. So our real kind of corporate ethos really is creating great places to live. So my remit covers the current development programme, and our board of management made a decision about 3 years ago that we would go down the route of developing everything to passive house standards. So currently we have over 250 units in our development new build programme, and we at the moment have 66 of these being extra care housing units across 2 sites within the region. So why passive house? So the main driving force for us really is probably the 3 bullet points there, and there's some kind of, this kind of alarming statistic in terms of fuel poverty in our region. Half the population that live within fuel poverty, and obviously that defined by spending 10% of their net income to pay for their fuel costs. So, and we're also we work quite closely with Dumfries and Galloway Regional Council and the Scottish Government. So we are also keen to address a climate emergency declared by our local council back in June 2019. And I mean, those are probably the 3 headline reasons, but there are other reasons, and we kind of know that the impact of passive house can have, some real benefits on physical health. So we know there's a strong link between good housing and health, and the actual living within a passive house can, benefit our customers in various different ways, and not just in physical health. There's mental well-being issues as well. That people living in a passive house, that they've got low fuel costs, that there's less pressures on finances, etc. So all that coupled together, it's quite a strong case really for going down the route that we have gone down. So where we're at the moment, Lower Housing Association, we have to date we've completed 4 fully certified passive house units. We have currently got 7 under construction on site, and the 4 that you see in this slide here are in Dumfries. So and they were delivered via a design and build contract. So in terms of our extra care projects, we kind of back in 2017 were approached by the local health and social care partnership. They were keen to develop extra care, the extra care housing model in the region. So we kind of have worked with them, and we have at the moment got 2 locations where we are working closely with them and their designers on delivering a passive house extra care developments, and these extra care developments will be part of a wider development of general needs housing. So the one at Moffat, it's 31 extra care, but we've also got 44 family general needs properties on it, and the development in Langham will have 35 extra care units with a further 65 general needs properties, and as I said, they'll all be built to Passive House standard. So really, our experience in terms of planning to extra care housing to Passive House standard, it really kind of starts right at the outset in terms of making sure you have the right people within the group that are driving this forward. So in terms of making sure that the demand there has been assessed from the outset, and there's a strong case to go down that route. And from our side, who are the sort of lead developers, making sure we've got the right design team in place, and it's not just about their Passive House credentials. They've got to be flexible in terms of design changes and those discussions with the main client group. And that also includes the client group providing us with the expertise that they have in terms of health professionals, and that may be social work or occupational therapists, that to make sure that we get the design of the properties right from the outset. And then once we get to that stage, we can replicate house types. Most of our extra care projects will be sort of 1 and 2 bedroom properties, single story. And also we've been fortunate enough to be able to bring in a contractor. We procured a framework about 4 or 5 months ago, so we've been able to bring a contractor on board really early in the design process, that they have a say in construction detail within the design team meetings. So and that's been a real benefit. We can standardize construction detail across the projects. And also a key feature of the discussions is make sure that all the parties involved know exactly what Passive House means, because that is a real challenge, and it's a real change for people moving from perhaps mainstream or older stock housing into Passive House units. So really, and some of our speakers earlier on have touched upon this, keeping the form simple of the Passive House construction. And you can see from this slide, the single story, fairly straightforward elevations. You don't want too many protrusions, etc., which complicates sort of thermal detailing, etc. So these are kind of what we're sort of proposing for extra care bungalows on our sites, and then we kind of develop this into a core and cluster model, where we've got the extra care houses around sort of central courtyards and sort of easy access, pedestrian access to sort of ancillary buildings where we can provide extra support, where there's staff can be based, etc. And these are kind of based around central sort of garden and landscaped areas. So in terms of being able to use what we've found on delivering a fairly small scale Passive House development, as in the first one we did, the 4 Passive House units, we've kind of tried to pick up on the lessons learned from that, and really this slide really here just kind of, I think, tries to communicate that in terms of making sure you've got the right design team and a contractor that is committed to the principles of Passive House. You need guys that are on board with it, not just the main contractor but subcontractors, and extremely disciplined approach to their work, and also having our staff buy into that ethos and make them fully aware of what Passive House is. And what we also learned was really, the sooner you can identify who's going into these units, the better, because you can start that engagement process with them. And it's really important at the point of handover that you fully explain Passive House and what it is, because it is completely different. We've had that experience with our first units. People, they've come from houses where you've got a radiator in every room. You may well have a focal point fire somewhere. That may well have been an electric fire or an open fire. and it is a completely different way of living for people. They can't get their head around, first up, that there isn't a radiator in every room, and it feels different. The controls are different. So that whole process and managing handover and moving people in and making sure they know how that works. So, and also our own side of things, the ongoing maintenance and making sure that our guys, we have our own in-house repairs team that do a majority of our cyclical and planned maintenance. So it's making sure those guys know what a passive house is. So they're going out to do a repair, and I think one of the speakers earlier mentioned, you've got to ensure the integrity of airtight membranes, etc. So basically knowing what the do's and don'ts on a passive house property. And really just making sure that we try and learn from each project and try and do things better the next time round. So really, just kind of in summary, what have we learned from passive house projects and what will be a benefit to our extra care housing projects? For me and for us as a team, improved construction details. We've learned a lot from the first project. We've changed party wall detailing, etc. It makes it easier to build. It's cheaper to build. So if you're learning, if you can introduce, as I say, more robust detailing, then it's all of a benefit. I think the next one really, in terms of benefits, the health benefits to our customers, and this has really been quite eye-opening. I touched upon it in earlier slides. What we have found with the small-scale 4-unit development is that certainly asthma sufferers, we have one of our tenants in one of the houses that hasn't had to use his inhaler since moving in, and he was a regular inhaler user. We also have a child living in one of the houses that had severe eczema, and it's apparent at the moment that the symptoms have reduced enormously, and that's a real great benefit that we can see for our customers. So hopefully going forward, that will translate into larger scale projects, and we'll see some real benefit for our customers. And the last thing, really, running costs on the huge benefit here, that the fuel bills and what people are paying every month has reduced hugely from what they were paying before in previous accommodation, and in comparison to what we've built in the past, just the sort of standard building regulations, we're noticing a huge difference. So, and what we try and do better, I think, and I've mentioned it before, that we need to engage earlier with the end user and making sure that the handover stage, we manage that better and make sure our customers are fully up to speed. And also future proofing, do as much as you can at build stage to make sure we're not going back in there to do further work. So we've taken decisions, we fit electric vehicle charging points at build stage. We make sure there's a Sky dish installed, because we've probably all seen it with new build properties. The Sky engineer turns up and the first thing he does is drill 10 holes through the outside of the property. So it's trying to do as much as you can at that stage, and also engaging and finding the right utility companies, because a lot of them, because the bills, the usage is so low, they find it hard to get their heads around, and that has given us some issues in getting some of our customers' utilities, bills and accounts sorted out. So lots to learn and lots to take forward. So really, we're at the beginning of the extra care housing journey for Lowburn Housing, but we've got some really exciting projects coming up, and I've got any questions there, but we're saving them for the Q&A, so I won't be taking any at the moment. So thank you very much.
Graham, thank you. That was a really excellent presentation, and brought the presentations really neatly to a close. I think they've all built on each other, and both a mixture of some of the sort of the facts and information right through to sort of think about some of the technical applications and the impact on things like fuel, energy and poverty, right through to the utilisation and the benefits for customers. So a real breadth of experiences from all four of you. Please, if you have haven't already, have a look at some of the comments coming through the chat box. And I'm going to now just go into the Q&A, because again, I think for each of you there have been a series of questions. So I don't know if you've had a chance to just have a quick browse. So again, I'm going to start with a question from Joan Rutherford. Has any consideration been given to adding minor repairs and adaptations, say a maximum of 4,000 to retrofits where appropriate, to make homes more decent? So I don't know if that's for you or Carol, Graham. Any thoughts around retrofitting?
Sorry,
sorry, Carol, you go.
No, you go, Graham. Yeah.
Retrofitting, yeah, we were kind of making some moves towards that. We've obviously, the Scottish Government have got some fairly ambitious targets in terms of carbon reduction. So we are certainly embarking on a programme of retrofit and energy energy improvement for our current stock, and that's kind of started at the stage of, if we do a window replacement program, we're going down the route of almost fitting passive house standard windows and doors, just so that the follow-ons, that if it's external insulated render, that at each stage we're improving that overall energy efficiency of the property, so that we're not going back and spending more money on further upgrades. So yeah, it's certainly something we're moving towards, and we've been looking at some of the options that are open to us on that front.
Anybody else want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't really sort of offer much advice on what has gone, because when we've been looking at the Welsh Government retrofit programme, I think individual RSLs, or unless they're part of the Pathfinder, people have sort of taken different approaches to how they've upgraded properties, and some they've thrown lots of money at them, and some they've looked at the worst first, so to speak, followed by others that how do we get the easiest ones up. So I mean, it doesn't really particularly answer that question, but I've not been not really a huge amount of input into that.
I might just make a small point about retrofit and the passive house standard, because there's a kind of a parallel standard called Enerfit, ENERPHIT, and stepwise, and it's used in Europe for larger housing developments, where there's going to be sequential upgrades. Like Mark mentioned, you'll upgrade the windows to the passive, or Graham mentioned, to the passive house standard when you do them. With that Enerfit and stepwise, it seems to encourage a plan that when those things will happen, and that there'll be a certification at the end, but the projects can be part of that process. Yeah.
Thanks. And Mark, I know you do some retrofits and you've used work around disabled facilities grants as a practice, and any thoughts on this question?
I think actually the RSL sort of sector, is more straightforward in a way. I think homes in private ownership, there's a huge amount of homes in private ownership, and trying to have some sort of system where there's an incentive for people to upgrade their homes and retrofit to improve energy efficiency is actually the greater challenge in many ways. So yeah, through the DFG work that we've done, we've tried to take a holistic approach to that and try to upgrade where possible, sort of external fabrics and things. So that is something that we try and look at. We don't just look at the extension in isolation. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting because the government did in England anyway have talked about issuing some guidance later this year around DFGs for local authorities. So it'll be interesting to see if there's anything around the green agenda, so to speak, in that, whether they go as far as passive house is another issue. And some other questions, and perhaps linked to, again, Graham, you talked about people with eczema and asthma in stock, in your stock. And the question from David: is there a risk that a focus on standards for sustainability, such as passive house, cuts across individual needs for inclusivity? And he talks specifically about people with a sensory impairment and people with auditory sensitivities. Any experience around that, or any feedback from tenants?
Well, because with the project we've completed is really a kind of general needs sort of family properties are all 3 beds. We don't yet have a huge amount of experience, and that is sort of coming with the extra care housing, and that will bring people with all sorts of needs into one central location, where the sort of care packages are provided on site. So we've got a lot of work probably in how we kind of overcome some of those challenges, and certainly in terms of dimension and some of those issues that people will suffer from. It's going to be a really it's going to be a challenge for us, and we're kind of looking at all kind. What can we do? Smart technology in terms of being able to monitor our properties and how we can. How that would feed back to sort of a central location, and rather than relying on the occupant to be expected to change controls, etc. That's something we could do remotely. So yeah, there's a bit of work to do yet on our side.
Yeah, that's something I think is really interesting in terms of what the future use of technology can have at home. But also Jill, who I know is on the participants list, may also talk about. Well, she's just put something into the box actually about work of care and repair, both in Scotland and England, but also some of the work the University of Stirling and others have done around the inclusive living toolkit as well. So that might be another useful link, and we can put that on in the chat box. Lots of congratulations. Sorry, anybody else wanted to come through? Did I miss somebody?
Sorry, yeah, I was just going to say something on that, Jeremy. I think from my point of view, I don't think there's any conflict particularly between the accessibility standards and Passivhaus standards. And although Passivhaus is partly an energy standard, it's also more so about the comfort of the internal environment. So it should be a vast improvement. For those sort of sensory needs above, what a standard current house to building regulations would be.
Thanks for that, Mark. Another question from Chris Wilkins. This may be for you, Patrick, which is around, and you may know what government CLT offer potential solutions about scale and pace and things around spanning timber becoming excluded in the assessment. And he talks about presumably helps with your net zero ambitions. In sequestering the carbon as it grows and it's replanted. Any thoughts on Chris's question, Patrick?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we've undertaken some other studies for university buildings using mass timber and the different scales it can work at. I mean, definitely you end up with a different structural grid to say you were looking at a concrete or a steel structure. So I would say the earlier you decide which way the structure is going, the better. So early embodied carbon models are important. And the optimal span for a mass timber will probably be different to, steel or concrete. I'm not a structural engineer. I won't have to go at guessing what the spans are.
Okay.
The other thing I would say, like for housing development, it doesn't have to be mass timber CLT, because CLT and glulam use more material than, say, standard framed timber with more lightweight timbers, and so the less material used, the less carbon. So depending on the scale of the project, there's a number of solutions.
And Graham, you talked about some of the cost and the cost benefits, both in terms of individuals around the dividend, but also in terms of the build costs. And Nigel Peacock asks, is there additional cost and delay incurred to going Passivhaus? If so, what is that additional cost?
The additional cost is probably, in a comparison on the first 4 units we did was around about 15% between the standard build and Passivhaus. And we're looking, obviously to drive that down in terms of economy of scale. So yeah, there is a premium in terms of cost. I don't think in terms of time scale it makes a huge amount of difference. I would imagine for the first development we did, it was new for the contractor, and it would probably take a bit more time than it would have if he was just rattling up a normal standard building regulation property. So I think once we get into, as I say, once we get into larger scale developments, the time scales will tighten, and as will the cost. And certainly that's certainly our hope anyway, and we're quite lucky in a way that the Scottish Government are extremely supportive of what we're doing in terms of the subsidy levels that they can put into projects. So if there's a gap there in terms of the funding, they've been very supportive in bridging that gap. If that includes, extra funding just to make it financially viable for us, and they have supported that. So, yeah, but there is a difference, and we certainly found that between probably, I think, around about 15%.
I think that may also help answer Nick Cummings' question as well.
Can I just say something on that, Jeremy, as well? Just in terms of the capital cost now will be more, but to meet the government targets, you've got 29 years, so you'll be retrofitting in the next 29 years anyway to bring them up to that standard. So you might as well spend the money now and save later. Would be my thoughts on that.
Yeah. Yes, thanks. There's quite a few more questions, and we've got a couple of minutes. So I'm just going to pick and choose a few. Right at the bottom on this is it's just been covered up. Let me just try and go. In terms of BREEAM, LEED, etc., does PH design contribute to the points? So things about BREEAM, LEED, etc. Anybody have got any knowledge about that?
I know for energy credits on LEED, we typically score quite high on the Passivhaus projects. If we're certifying to LEED and Passivhaus, or BREEAM and Passivhaus, we're beating BREEAM excellent in all of our healthcare projects by doing Passivhaus standards. But then there's a whole raft of other credits for BREEAM or that one. For example, we've used the MATA1 credit on BREEAM to track the embodied carbon. Because Passivhaus isn't talking about embodied carbons.
Okay, well, let's quickly move on. Jane Lawson asked issues around very much about what is it, and around insulation, air source heat pumps, and whether this is about passing costs onto the customer or not. Any thoughts about whether this is an additional cost for tenants or the customer, or is it stuff you can sort of build in?
Certainly from a social housing provider, Jeremy, it's not. We don't pass those costs on to the customer in terms of rent. We're strictly governed by the amount of rent we can charge for social housing in our area, and that's defined by the Scottish Government and local housing allowance. So it's certainly not a cost we're passing on.
And I think what she's probably more getting at is whether some of the measures that some landlords are taking, whether that actually might cost the customer more personally in terms of their energy efficiency, their fuel use as well. But I think what you were saying, Graham, throughout was that there's a lower utilisation.
Yeah. We're certainly in a pacifier. Yeah, no doubt that it's certainly more energy efficient in terms of the cost. If you're going about an air source heat pump, yeah, it's cost. If you're comparing that to, say, moving from a house with a combi boiler using gas, and also you've got an electricity consumption there as well, that moving into a new house, new passive house with an air source heat pump will cost them an awful lot less than what were paying in a previous property.
And I just want to conclude, I'm afraid, with Martin. I'm not afraid it's Martin Hodges' question, but I think, in terms of the context of COVID in mind, is there a view on how ventilation methods installed in passive house design compared to traditional construction in respect of reducing disease transmission within households? That's probably an exam question, but any immediate thoughts?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I don't know. To be honest with you, I don't know if there's been a study on it, but it's more controlled. So you have constant fresh air intake and constant exhaust of stale air. So in theory, I would have thought that you should have a cleaner air environment, throughout the day and night. So yeah, I think it would be better than if you're just trying to control it yourself through opening windows on a sporadic basis.
Thanks. Any other thoughts on that? I think the only thing I would add to it, I know that PRP Architects produced a really useful little booklet around COVID and design. So I know we've got on the website. So please do have a look at that. And I think Claire Cameron's actually on the participants list. But if she wants to post something into the chat box, please do. Otherwise, I'm afraid I'm going to have to draw this to a conclusion. I know we could probably go on for another 25-30 minutes. Some great questions on that. Please do join us next week when we are bringing together our second part of our happy hours on looking at intergenerational living, which is chaired by Stephen Burke of United for All Ages and the Intergenerational Housing Network. And then just to give you a plug for something downstream, Graham, I think, touched on technology in particular. We're launching our Technology for an Ageing Population inquiry report on the 26th of October. So the next couple of happy hours, some further really useful information and sessions to share with you. So really looking forward to seeing you all again. Can I, on behalf of the HousingLIN, thank all our presenters this afternoon, and also for your support, IBI and West Body Arcadia. Really look forward to pulling this together. We look forward to sharing the slides and the recording of today's session with everybody. And before we go, please do complete the feedback. We really value your comments back. So thanks and bye from us.
Thanks, everyone.